Okay. Where is my music and why can I not end it? Yes, I am live. There I am. Hallelujah. Now, I apologize to everyone. This is my first time doing this, so I'm hoping that I can make all of this work really well. And that as we get moving into this, we're going to be able to have a great broadcast. At the moment, we're having a few technical difficulties, and hopefully that will stop soon. Okay. I need to end this music, and I don't know how to do that. Because that's annoying. Okay, well, I apologize for the music, but we're going to get started. And let's see if I can bring Cheryl Shea, my guest, onto the platform. And we're going to hopefully get this thing working the way it's supposed to. So bear with me for just a second. Here we go. There's Cheryl, but I still can't hear you. I still can't hear you. Oh, there I can. I can hear you.
I think you couldn't hear me before because I was off stage, it said.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Now if I could, there we go. There's a little music sign. Can you hear me?
Yep.
And I can hear you. Perfect. Okay, everyone, we're making this happen. This is my friend Cheryl Shea that I have on as a guest today. And I've known Cheryl, man, we go back a long time. It's been, I think, about 30 years because I remember I got pregnant with Jared after we had already met, and I was already working with you for a short period of time. So I'm thinking it's got to be, he's 28. So it's 30 years.
Feel really old now. Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry, me too. I apologize. So yeah, we go back a long time, and you know, kind of, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro, and then I'm just going to let you take it away, Cheryl, for a bit here. So, you know, like I said, about 30 years ago, I started my own inner healing journey, and Cheryl was the one who was there and led me through a couple of groups on inner healing from childhood sexual abuse, and I don't know if I can say that. We'll find out. I said it. So we'll see what happens. Okay. And then after I had done that, there was a time of mentoring where you mentored me and you worked, you know, and I started to lead some groups. And then we worked together in your ministry, you know, Mars Hill Center in Edmonton, Alberta. And a lot has happened since then. And now you are a full-fledged counselor and, you know, going into retirement soon. But that's my introduction for you. And so here we go. We've been talking about, in my real raw and honest, we've been talking about forgiveness. We've been talking about what forgiveness is, what forgiveness isn't. And in doing that, you know, we've come up with there's been some good questions, some good conversations that have happened. In this topic, I'll be honest, most people send me private conversations because they don't want to talk about it online. And I understand that, you know, because, you know, they might be concerned that other people might see the information and just make things worse. So is there anything that you want to say before you get started? We're going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll just answer some questions. So if you have any questions, just put them down in the chat and we'll get to them. I have a few of the questions that have been sent in to me prior. So Cheryl, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, forgiveness is, I was thinking about this again this morning, getting ready for this, and I realized that one of the struggles for me with forgiveness was when I really started to follow Jesus. I was about 17, and I was raised in an extremely nominal Christian home. My mom had been raised Anglican, and I was baptized and I was confirmed. And then shortly after that, I walked out of the church and said, God, if you're real, you better show me, because otherwise I can't do this anymore. And he did. That's another whole story. But I was also a good kid. It was the 1970s. I went to a drinking party once in high school and went, this is boring. Why are people doing this?
Oh,
and
we're
went
so
home
opposite.
to watch Hockey Night in Canada. So one of my struggles with forgiveness was that I wasn't one of those people. I know Cheryl's testimony is quite different than mine. I wasn't saved from a life of horrible abuse of alcohol or smoking pot in the 70s or anything like that. And the milieu at the time in the church was, that's the people that needed to get saved, which they did. But because I didn't have those things, it was hard for me to see the things that I needed to be forgiven for. And it really started probably there was some inner healing that had happened for me that was the beginning of things in my 20s. And then I think when I moved to Edmonton in 1988, I think that's when the journey for me in terms of forgiving others really started, because I started to see, through seeing a counselor, by the way, that I remember driving home one day and thinking, I treated that person really horrible. It was an ex-boyfriend. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And that's the first time I remember sort of having to deal with my behavior. Obviously, there was tons of behavior before that God was probably like, Cheryl, come on, smarten up. But I was like, well, I'm not doing all these really bad things, so I must be okay. So that was kind of my beginning of my journey with forgiveness.
That's good. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like for me, like my story is very different. I did all the things you didn't, but I also watched Hockey Night in Canada. So so yeah, a very, very different story. So that's good. So what would you like to share with us today about forgiveness? And maybe one of the questions I'll start just by asking you is, why is forgiveness so hard?
It's hard because I think it goes up against our human nature. We want to be vindicated, and we don't want to let someone off the hook for something they've done to hurt us. And I also think it's hard for people because I don't think it's probably changed now in many churches, but I don't think it's been taught well, in the sense that the impression I got was, you say, I forgive so-and-so and the work is done. And I remember really clearly when I moved to Edmonton, sitting in a church service and realizing that, I needed to forgive my mom and dad. And so I said that in my head, I need to forgive, I choose to forgive my mom and dad. Nothing changed that I could see. And I still wasn't able to really understand what I needed to forgive them for. So it was very abstract. And I didn't understand the actual impact on me. And then and this is a term I think you might use too, Cheryl, what my reactive sins were because of the emotional neglect in my family. So then it was about probably just a couple of years later, when the evening service, the youth pastor was talking, and he talked about things that teenagers need to resolve in order to grow and be healthy adults. And I was 30 something at the time. I was a marketing manager. I was doing well in that regard. And I remember him going through the list and thinking, nope. And that's when I started to realize the things in me that weren't healthy, emotionally or spiritually, because of the lack I had in my family of origin. So that's when I eventually, with great intrepidation, which is really funny since I became a counselor, went to see a psychologist, a Christian psychologist. And I remember sitting in his room and just being like frigid, and not, even when he would say, well, what is it that you here to deal with? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. So I couldn't forgive in that situation, because I didn't even know what my response was, clearly, to what I had experienced as a child, not just in my family, but I was bullied in school because I was a very obese kid. I didn't really have a lot of friends. I never had a date until I was 24. Like there was a whole bunch of stuff there that I had just shut down inside. So I think a lot of times we have a hard time forgiving others because we don't even really understand what's gone on. If what they've done to us is even hurtful, so we don't really forgive. We just sort of push it aside and not really deal with it, not really deal with how their sin against us has hurt us, and then how we have become sinful in our reaction to dealing with that hurt. And that, I think, is one of the biggest reasons why we struggle with forgiveness, because we can say, oh yeah, that, I'm in an abusive relationship. I forgive my husband for pushing me up against the kitchen counter and hurting me. But then we sort of understand that, but we don't understand how that's hurt our soul.
Right.
And we also are often taught that, we need to forgive and we're not allowed to have boundaries. Sometimes that's the message we get too.
Right.
So sometimes we just keep getting hurt over and over again, when part of that forgiveness would be, I forgive them, blah, blah. And maybe I need to be separate from this person for a while.
Right. That's good. That's good. I think it's important. One of the things you said there is that you were there and you didn't know even what you were there for. Like you said, and I think that's huge, right? Because I find that for myself, when I came to initially, I came for the abuses that had happened, intimately, I'll use that, as a child, right? That was inappropriate, right? And so I knew what I was there for, but I remember distinctly working with you and at one point realizing that although I had forgiven my abuser, I remember the day when it hit me like a ton of bricks that the person I was most angry with was not my abuser. It was the secondary abuser, which in my case was my mother, right? And so because I was like, how could you not know? Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you do this, right? And so that was a huge step too. So I think it's important to realize that we do have unforgiveness. And that's actually one of the questions that somebody sent in, is that do we need to forgive how does it go? Do I need to forgive if someone has hurt me, but it doesn't seem like a big deal? I tend to let those go and not worry about them. Is this the way for me to handle it? That was one of the questions. So, you already started on that. So how did you find out what you needed to forgive, or that you needed to forgive your parents? When did that happen? How long into the journey?
Well, it was an ongoing journey. And I mean, the bigger piece was with my dad that raised me. I also never knew my birth father. That's another piece over there. Okay. But I had to come to terms with how his own brokenness, I guess I would say, and detachment had affected me. So in order to forgive him, I had to first of all understand that it was his behavior that had affected me, and that's why I was the way I was, because I was a kid. Okay, this would be different if you've never had any emotional abuse and you're 40. It's a different thing. But when you're a kid and you grow up without the half decent sometimes the word is used, good enough parenting, then there's going to be wounds in you. And so until you sort of understand that, you can't, it's difficult to forgive, because then I could start to say, I forgive my dad for not nurturing me. I forgive my dad for not showing me what a healthy man looks like. I forgive my dad. And then there was all these different things that could start to fall into place. And then because my mom tended to be more passive, then I had to work on that because she was passive. So I learned to be passive, and actually passive aggressive, and had to deal with that, and then could start to do the forgiveness with my mom. The forgiveness with my dad that raised me was certainly the bigger piece.
Right.
But I also remember, so part of my journey too was in, I think I'd gone back to seminary to finish my Master of Divinity, and I just got really convicted about how much I hated men. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. And I wrote, the ministry I ran, we did a little newsletter at the time, and I wrote an article called My Apology to Men. Okay. But the reason I could do that was because in that season, God had brought into my life wonderful men that honored me as a sister and cherished me. And that brought some healings, enough healing that I could go, what a jerk I've been. Like, no wonder I'm not getting dates, because they pick up that I hate men. So, that sort of had to be worked through. So that was a huge piece for me. But that was, I was in my early 30s then. So sometimes these processes that we wish would go faster, it's because God's restructuring our personality. And that takes time. That's good. That's really good. That's really good. I think I sometimes, people will sometimes say things to me like, they'll say, why are you, like, you're navel gazing, right? Like, you're always, what do you have to say? And that, what do you have to say about that? Right? Like, when you come out of a history, and we all have history, right? Like, you could be raised in a really great home, or you can be raised in a very abusive home, and you'll still come out of that with things that you need to work through. You're still going to come through that and have to look at some areas of forgiveness, because parents are not perfect. And so there's going to be, something that you're going to carry through from that. So can you maybe talk about that for a minute? Yeah, I mean, I think we live in a broken world. So it doesn't matter what our family's like. We're going to be hurt. And because we're not perfect ourselves, we are going to respond to that in not godly ways. Sometimes we do think we've responded it. Oh, I forgive that person and I love them. Yeah, go there. I've heard so many people say that, and I'm like, why are you grinding your teeth when you say that? Like, no. So forgiveness is, and this is the prayer. I kind of adapted it from an author by the name of Neil Anderson, who wrote a book years ago called The Bondage Breaker. And in his steps to freedom, the one I've used the most is on forgiveness, because it explains it really well. And the little prayer he uses is, God, I choose to forgive, fill in the blank, for fill in the blank, what specifically they did, because it made me feel, fill in the blank, and I release them to you. And so that's become the model that I use even now, where there's, because people are going to hurt us all the time. We hurt people without even knowing it as well. And so that's become what I use as a model for what forgiveness is, because it gets to call it a bitter root. We'll get to that, but it gets down to that bitter root that if we don't forgive and also ask God to heal that, then the forgiveness is never gonna sprout and bear fruit. It's gonna die off because that bitterness is still in us.
No, that's good. That's good. And in thinking that, I'm gonna say, I think too that sometimes what we do is, like you're talking about the bitter root, and I'm going to be going into that in some of the up and coming conversations I'm going to have about forgiveness and unforgiveness, right? Is what holds that in place. So, what else, when we're talking about this, what are some of the other things that you find that people get caught up in? Like people think that they've forgiven. I know I've done it myself, where I feel like I've forgiven somebody, and then only to find out that I've not. So if you were going to tell somebody how they were to know whether they've forgiven, what would you say to them? Or know that they haven't forgiven?
Okay, that's actually a bit of a tough one for me. And I was thinking about this in terms of my dad earlier this morning, that when he died, I wasn't numb. There was no feeling, and it wasn't numbness. There was no unresolved issues. I was fortunate that I was at a Holy Spirit conference that weekend,
Right.
in Stony Plain, by the way, Jill, and it was a good worship leader, and I was enjoying myself, and God said to me, "Don't worry about your dad. We've dealt with it spirit to spirit."
Okay.
And I think that was because, in some measure, because by that point I had let go of the hurt, and I had no further expectations about him.
That's
what he could or couldn't do. That's probably where boundaries come in, because sometimes if we have a person in our lives or people in our lives, I mean, workplaces are notorious for this. We're in a really dysfunctional workplace, and so the forgiving 70 times 7 comes in with your boss because they are not fair or whatever. But as long as you're in that constant situation,
right.
Then you're constantly having to say that prayer and forgive that person. And so sometimes that forgiveness is going to be an ongoing thing because of the situation we're in. I think a lot of people end up in very abusive workplace situations where they're taken advantage of, where, they're not paid properly, they're expected to work ridiculous hours without compensation, all those kind of things. And so there needs to be a forgiveness there, perhaps about the boss, perhaps about the system of the company, might include more people. But then at some point it might be, and actually I need to get out of this abusive relationship.
Right.
And sometimes we need to really seek God's wisdom about that, because if we keep being trampled on by other people, we need to have boundaries.
Right.
And boundaries are just saying, that attitude, that's your problem. It's not my problem. And because it's not my problem, I'm sending out resumes to other companies, whatever the situation is. And so sometimes that's why we have problems with forgiveness, because I think we think it's a magical thing. And so if we forgive someone, then God's just going to come in and they're going to be a changed person. Well, no, God doesn't work that way.
That's good. That's actually really a really great statement.
Yeah.
Right there. That we forgive and they're going to magically become a different person. I think that's huge, right? Because I think in our mind, I think that's really what we do believe, right? Like if I forgive them, then they change to my liking. And that's not what happened.
Yeah.
That's good. That's very good.
Yeah. So that's another aspect of forgiveness that I think we forget about. That it's about freeing ourselves from that unhealthy connection with that person.
Right.
Not us rescuing that other person. And maybe that's where that comes in more often, is if we've been in a unhealthy relationship where we're used to rescuing people and people pleasing, that maybe that's where we come into that. I hadn't really thought all the way through there, but that might be the case. Is then we think we're forgiving because then we're rescuing this person.
That's very
And
good.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because I don't know about you, I'm sure it is the same as with me, is that very often what I have to tell people when we start talking is that there are no excuses for somebody else's bad behavior. We're here to talk about you, and we're
yeah,
here to talk about how this thing has hurt you. There's no excuses that they have PTSD because they were in the army, right? And they saw battle and they came home and they took that out on 5-year-old you. There's no excuses for somebody else's bad behavior. If you're going to get free, you have to look at how it damaged you and
yeah,
just talk the truth, right? And I think, Kim, that's a really big hurdle. It can be a really big thing for people to get over because they're like, well, I can't be angry at my mom because I can't be upset with my dad because, and that's even becomes even more complicated if they're past when they come, right? Because now we have, how do I forgive somebody when they're already gone, right? So do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I guess, I mean, the scripture about anger is be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. So in other words, deal with your anger.
Right.
And if continuing to be in a relationship with someone, in whatever kind of relationship that is, continues to make you angry, then to me, it's like, okay, that person is hurting you. And why are you letting yourself do that when there are other options? Now, I will also say, some of you who are older, mind you, her books are still in print, Corrie ten Boom, who her and her family had rescued Jewish people in the Netherlands during the Second World War, and her sister and her dad were imprisoned. Dad died and sister died in the prison. Corrie continued on, and she in her books talks a lot about forgiveness when you're in a situation like that, which is really great stuff, but most of us aren't trapped to that extent,
right?
And that's a whole different scenario about forgiveness. And maybe you feel trapped, but maybe part of that is fear, and maybe what you need to deal with before you, in the process of dealing with forgiveness, is fear about what if I disconnect from that person? How will I support myself? How will I, so some, and I've talked to lots of women over the years that were in a marriage that was usually often emotionally abusive.
Right.
And it's a real struggle to work through that. And some decide to stay, some decide to leave. That's between them and God. But if you decide to stay, it's really hard. That's the forgive 70 times 7, and probably 70 times 7 every day. And forgiveness, like we talked about before, doesn't mean diminishing how that person sinned against you.
That's good.
And that's where forgiveness, if we diminish what the person did, we're not truly forgiving.
That's good. And how does that impact us?
Pardon me?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Okay.
How does that impact us when we diminish it?
Well, then we keep allowing their behavior to happen. Like we're not really loving them because we're not calling them to be truly the person God created them to be. Mm-hmm. God didn't create anyone to be an abuser.
That's true.
Right? That's so true. He created us in his image. So all of our brokenness is somehow because of our humanity. And when you continue to allow that abuse happening, you're not helping the other person. Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah. And I don't think you're loving yourself well either.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. Earlier you had talked about, mentioned something about what forgiveness is not, basically. And so I think that, oftentimes this is what I do. When I've been in situations where I need to forgive somebody and don't want to, right? Because we all go through that, right? Like it's a human.
Totally.
And when somebody slices us deeply, my thing is avoidance, right? I'm not denying, but I avoid. And so if they're going to be there, I'm not going there, right? Like if they're going to be, if I see their car pull up at Safeway, I'm like, I can go to IGA, right? It's like, I don't have to go there, right? So this is one of the things, like that whole avoidance. That's how I know I actually still need to do some forgiveness, right? Because in the church community, and it doesn't matter, I found as I age that it's such a small community, right? Like I can go, when I lived in Edmonton, I could come to Calgary and I would meet somebody there that I know, right? I'd go to Red Deer, I could go to Medicine Hat and I would meet somebody there that I know. And it's so crazy to me how it's such a small community. And so when you do have something against somebody that's in the church, right, you have to deal with that. So avoidance, is there any other things that you see that people do that make them believe? Because after you've avoided somebody for a while, for a long enough time, you get to the point you actually feel good. You actually feel like it's done. It's a done deal till you see them. And then when you see them, wow, I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm shaking, you have all the emotions.
Yeah.
Really all you did is you just suppress that, right? So
avoidance is one thing we do. Minimizing would be another thing we do. Well, it wasn't that bad, but that's also a form of avoiding. Nothing else is coming to mind. Yeah. But gossip would be a way of avoiding or a way of sabotaging or whatever. But, sometimes we would say we've forgiven someone and then we go and tell someone else what we've forgiven this person for. Well, they really don't need to know unless it's to protect them, which 9 out of 10 times it's got nothing to do with that.
That's true.
So, so that would be something we would tend to do as well. The avoidance, I totally get that. Yeah.
So in my not doing that, I've really picked up on beginning to do on a consistent basis what I call the Matthew principle, right? You go to your brother, you have the conversation. If they won't listen, then you bring somebody, and then you have to eventually take it to the pastor of the church, which is freeing for me, but I'll be honest and say it really doesn't always go well, right? Like it really doesn't. And depending on who you're talking to, those things can actually seem to make it more complicated. So when I look at forgiveness, I think I'm going to ask you this question. This is my question. And if anybody has any questions that they want to add, just type them in the comment section and we'll get to them. I do have some other ones here. This might have stirred some questions as we're going. So for me, and I'll have a couple different scenarios here, but I had an incident where I had gone to this individual and I'd had the conversation and I said, here's some things that we need to work on, right? Like, you've done this and I'm just bringing it to you because I would like to make reconciliation, right? And it was really said, no, we're not having any conversation. I haven't done anything. I haven't said anything. It's done. And I'm like, okay, but why is it then that all these people are coming to me and telling me that you've said things about me? What have I done, right? So it's this whole conversation. So to step from having this initial conversation with that person to bringing someone with you, how do you do that without the gossip part of it, right? Like how do you bring someone else along, right? Like that's always been a question that I'm like, okay, so how does that work exactly? And I know that might be a really hard question, and I'm sorry, but you've always been my hard question person.
Oh, thanks, Cheryl. Thanks. I think that the key thing there is that is the person that you need to take with you is someone that understands that process and has, to a large measure, worked through their own issues.
That's good.
So just because they're a deacon in your church or an elder doesn't mean that they're in that place.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. That's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me, so is the purpose of going and forgiving or asking for forgiveness so that you can restore relationship, is that the reason why we forgive, so that we can continue in relationship? Or is there another reason why we actually forgive?
Yes and no. Yes, it can restore relationship, but it also may not restore relationship. And I think when we go with the intent that we're doing this discussion with this other person and a witness to restore relationship, even if there's true forgiveness there, that relationship may not be restored.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's important to realize.
Can you give an example?
Oh, I hate that. I forgive you for that, Cheryl. Another example would be, so someone's done something really abusive and they say, I'm sorry, please forgive me. Has their behavior changed? Right? If it was gossip, are they saying now I'm not going to gossip anymore? They might be in a place where they don't even really understand what gossip is. So you can't necessarily assume that the relationship is going to be restored, because that other person that hurt you, the example used was gossip, and they could say, oh, I'm really sorry, forgive me, but you've got to see that they're not gossiping all the time anymore. Right.
I see this a lot in abusive situations in the home, right?
Yeah.
And there's this escalation, right? Oftentimes, right? Like it's verbal abuse, and it's not good. And then it's like, well, he just shoved me. He just pushed me, and I fell down the stairs or whatever. And so there's always this forgiveness, because abuse is cyclical, right? Like it comes where, like, you go through the honeymoon period and then you circle around again. And so I see that a lot in situations like that. And so I think that's a good indicator, like a good example as well. Like, when do you tell somebody that forgiveness, you can forgive and release yourself, but you're looking for that shift in that other person? When they come to you and they say they're sorry, you do actually need to see the change, because trust is earned. It's just not given, right? And if they've broken trust, whether it's in a marital relationship where infidelity has been, or whether it's abuse, right? Trust is earned. It's not freely just handed out to everybody that comes along.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, trusting someone is different than forgiving someone.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, we can forgive anyone, but trusting them has to be earned. And I've never done a lot of marriage counseling in my practice. I tend to deal more with trauma and anxiety and depression, stuff like that. But the bits that I have done, it's like often there's been, like you say, a pattern for the couple, and then they get there and there's usually one person that is willing to change and the other person that can't see that their behavior is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And often they're, well, because they did this, I did that.
Right.
Oh, okay. And these are people that would call themselves Christians. So, it's not always as clean cut as it looks. But I think in those kind of situations, it's really important to say, like, yes, I can forgive this person, but if I stay in this relationship, am I helping them change?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if you are still there and they're still able to verbally or abuse you in other ways, you're not helping them change. You're kind of feeding their addiction in a way. It's like someone, stopping drinking alcohol, but you show up every day with a bottle of wine. You're not actually helping them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. That's good. On the other hand, you can't actually force somebody else to change, right? And
No,
so,
you can't.
people who get married and they say, well, they'll change. They're not going to change.
They're not going to.
They're not going to change.
What you see is what you get. Yeah.
This is as good as it's going to get. So,
Yeah.
I mean, they may in time as their relationship with the Lord grows, but you have to see that when you get married. You can't go in hoping that 10 years down the road, they're going to be a different person, because who they are is the person that you married. And if you were okay with it on the day that you got married, why aren't you okay with it 15 years in? Right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of women, whether Christian or not, we have this nurturing piece in us that wants to help people change. And no, it doesn't matter if you're 20 or 40 or 62, like I was when I got married. That was the biggest thing for me, is this is how they are. Is that okay? Yeah, it was excellent. So it was good, and it's still good.
Yeah.
But I think back in the few times I did have longer relationships, and I kept hoping they were going to change, and it's like, no, like you can't go into any kind of long-term relationship that way.
That's
Even
right.
with a friend, if you make friends with someone that you know to be a gossip in the church, that's your problem.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
really good. Yeah. That's good. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? You can start posting them. I'm going to move into a few of the questions that I have here, because we have about 20 minutes left. And so one of the questions I have, and I think you've kind of touched on it already, is it possible to feel that you don't need to forgive someone because you don't feel like they've hurt you, but they have, right? So when does that process of forgiveness begin to take place? Does that make sense, the way that I read that?
Yeah. Well, and I think as Christians, it should always be like, whether or not we feel wounded by what they did, if we say, okay, I'm trying to think of an example, they borrowed $100 from me 2 years ago and said we pay it back, and they haven't. Whatever, maybe $100 isn't a big deal to you, but what they've done is they've broken trust with you.
Right.
And so maybe you have to identify that. And even if it's not for you a big deal, you need to release that person again to God and not lend them any more money.
That's good.
Release that
Boundaries.
person to, release that person to God, which is what forgiveness does.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might not be a big deal for them, but spiritually, it might change things, start changing things for them.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I think back years ago to a woman who was in an abusive relationship, and I worked with her for a couple of years. And this is where the boundaries needed to take place. This is where boundaries needed to be something that she started to erect, but felt that when she forgave, it meant that they went back to the beginning, right? So she was able to, so I forgive you. And so I'm not holding you responsible for anything that you do. That means I've forgiven you, so I stay. I've forgiven you until the next time you abuse me. I've forgiven you. And so it's like, well, I've forgiven him. So that means that we're good. And inevitably, and eventually what ended up happening is this, and you might remember me talking to you about this, eventually what ended up happening is that this gentleman that she was married to ended up bringing a loaded shotgun into the bedroom and propping it up in the corner. And I'm going, you need to leave, right? Like, forgiveness is one thing, but this isn't going to end well if you don't do something. Mm-hmm. So I think that we struggle often with boundaries around forgiveness. Maybe you want to just touch on that just a little bit.
Well, I think, the one thing that we're in control of mostly is ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're not in control of anyone else's choices. So forgiveness releases us from that person that has sinned against us. But that doesn't change their behavior. And if we keep allowing that behavior, we're basically saying, I forgive you and that's fine. No problem. It's fine. So we're giving them a wrong message, actually.
Right. And the thing that comes to me too is there has to be a part of self-love and self-appreciation that's mixed in that, so that you know that you don't deserve to be that punching bag, that you were created as a daughter of the king, right? And so this behavior is not what your father would want someone to hand out to you. And so it isn't a test on the 70 times 7, right?
No.
It's about, can you forgive, and can you put up with your boundaries too? So I hope in talking about the 70 times 7, I say this too. I think we know too that we need to continue to forgive when the thoughts continue to plague us, right? When we're doing something, or we lay down on our bed. This is always a good one, when you lay down on your bed, or you're talking to somebody and they feel the need to fill you in on some things that the person who's wounded you has done, and then you're stuck in that loop of thought again, right? And you're going, I need to forgive them again, because if I can't lay down on my bed and I can't leave it at the cross, I can't leave it with Jesus, then that means I'm still holding on to something. And so that's another 70 times 7 doesn't have to be an outward act. It can just be what's stuck in your head.
Your mind. Yeah. And I think of times where it was like that prayer I gave earlier, it was like a constant thing, probably 10, 12 times a day for about a couple of weeks. And then it became less and less, but these memories would come back, and my anger would come back, and my disappointment would come back, and there I had to go through that again. And if someone's being abusive, it's not an easy thing to forgive them. And if they've been physically abusive to you, you're forgiving them for controlling you, for shaming you, for physically hurting you, for emotionally hurting you. And actually, just because this keeps coming up here today, for the people that are watching, go online and find something called a power and control wheel. It's basically a wheel, starts in the center and then shows you how abusive relationships can become deadly, basically. And murder is maybe a worse sin than separation. Because a lot of times when you hear of a woman being killed, sometimes a man, it's been an abusive relationship.
That's true.
So you're not helping a person by having them by you staying there, because they haven't been caught. They haven't seen the consequences of their behavior. So you're not forgiving, you're enabling the behavior. And I know that's really hard. Did some contract work with a program for women who have left domestic violence situations. It's a hard one. It's a hard one when you've married someone and thought, oh, they were a little whatever, and next thing you know, they're pushing you down the stairs, or bringing a gun home and putting it under their pillow, or other horrific stories I've heard. But you're not helping them become who God wants them to be by allowing them to continue in that behavior. I mean, Jesus doesn't allow us to continue in that behavior, right? Like, I think anyone watching knows the times when God said, hello, what are you doing? That's wrong. And so he doesn't want his children, and even those that don't know him yet, he doesn't want them to live that way. And we need to stop thinking that us forgiving is enough, because we also don't want to enable other people's bad behavior.
Right. That's good. I'm going to ask another question here. It says, the question is, do I always need to go to the person to forgive them? And the rest of it was very long. And so basically, this is the question. And so it's basically that, they were in an abusive situation as a child, and it's just unpleasant to be in the environment. So do you need to go to a person in order to forgive them?
No, you don't. Most of the situations I've been in where I've needed to forgive someone, I did not approach the person because it wasn't safe to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And also because, like with my dad in particular, he wouldn't have understood it.
Mm-hmm.
Like he just wouldn't have got it. And in other situations, it either the person was maybe a Christian, but I knew that they weren't. There was one time I did, I'll back that up. She didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
I never did that. I'm like, yeah, you did this, and this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so unless someone seems to be spiritual enough, mature enough to have that conversation, it ends up not necessarily going well. And so you don't have to go to the person, but you have to forgive that person and maybe pray for them on a regular basis. But you're forgiving to me is always about, became always about letting God deal with them. So I'd shared with Cheryl earlier, this is the imagery I use, and I think this comes from Neil Anderson too, I can't remember. But if I'm dealing with forgiving someone because I'm really bad I forgive you, take it back. I forgive you, take it back.
Yeah.
So I picture a hook on the wall, and under the hook is God or Jesus or whatever you want to put on there. And so I have to close my eyes and see that I am taking that person by their shirt collar and I am hanging them on God's hook. Because God is the one that's going to deal with them, not me. I can't change them. I already tried, right? And sometimes if I'm really upset with this person, to be honest, they're flailing around and sometimes they're just hanging there. But that tells me what I'm feeling still too, right? Like I'm still really mad at that person because I want them to suffer a bit. But that, for me, I need that visualization because it for me, it visualizes me letting go of that person, which is what forgiveness is, and putting them on God's hook, and God can deal with them.
Yeah.
And especially if it's, if Cheryl and I don't know that we ever did, but if Cheryl and I had a disagreement, we could sit down and straighten that out and we would be okay because we're both mature enough in the Lord. But with other people, they might not be in that place. And so really what needs to happen is we need to put them on God's hook.
That's
so
good.
That he can deal with them. Because we can't. And also going to people is sometimes about manipulating the relationship too, trying to get them to come back. So you have to be careful about that too.
Yeah. And I agree. I think what I do is I just see them in my hands like this, right? And all the baggage and all the hurt and all the stuff, and I just hand that over to the Lord. I'm
okay, yeah.
Same thing, right? But I think it is important to be able to see that once you've done the forgiveness, your job is done, right?
Done. Yeah.
And now it's up to the Lord to deal with that. They don't need to agree with you, or they can, outright deny anything. And I find that happens a lot, especially with childhood SA, right? Like, when it's that, right? Like, when a small child has been taken advantage of intimately by somebody else, right? An older individual. I think that is, if you go to somebody and say, I forgive you, without them coming to you and asking for forgiveness. And there's a big difference there. Saying that I forgive somebody is not the same as having someone come and say, will you forgive me? You're taking the initiative to forgive the hurt that's happened to you. And I think when it comes to that kind of childhood intimate abuse, is I think that if you go to somebody and you say, I forgive you for doing this, and for touching me, and for, for forcing me, or whatever it is, for speaking those things that you said, they 9 times out of 10 will not admit to the fact that they did that in the first place. They're not going to say, no, thank you. They're going to say, I never did that.
I never did that. Yeah.
It's how it's going to come. I never, what are you talking about? You had a bad dream, or, they're generally speaking, they're not going to admit to it until the Lord gets a hold of them. And in my case, I actually, I did the forgiveness around that. And then several years later, my abuser came to me and called me on the phone and wept openly of the things that he had done to me as a child. Now, that's not going to happen for most people. Unfortunately, I was really thankful that it did happen for me. And it did, in some ways, restore relationship. But this is where the boundaries are. Even though this person is a family member, they are never going to babysit my grandkids. They are never going to be in a place where they're around my grandchildren. That's not going to happen. They're not going to put them in the car, not going to take them. None of that's going to happen. And that's a boundary. And the reason that boundary is there, because even though I've forgiven and I've released that person to the Lord, they're not safe. And I don't know if even when the Lord touched them, that they put all of those things behind them. I have to look at it and I have to go, maybe they did, and maybe they didn't. But the truth is, I don't know that. And because I don't know that, I have a duty and I have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable people around me as well. And so that's a boundary, I think, that, that is a good example, of what we've been talking about. So,
yeah, definitely.
We're not going to get to all of the questions, but I do want to ask you this one, and then we're going to wrap up. This is a tough one. I'm going to tell you that right now. And I went, who's tough, right?
I'll have a drink of water in just a sec.
So the question is this: how or when does what someone do to me become my problem?
How or when does what someone did to me become my problem? When what they did to you is now causing you to hurt yourself and other people.
Okay.
So when you talk about, this hopefully is an obvious example. When I worked with women who were in a physically abusive relationship and had kids, that even though maybe the husband isn't abusing the wife in front of the kids are still experiencing that. Maybe they hear it, you think they don't, but they do. So that becomes a place where your stuff needs to be dealt with, because if you don't, it's affecting other people.
That's very good. Very good.
And in those situations, forgiveness is needed and wonderful, but it's not going to change the abuser, like Cheryl's already talked about. But you need to protect those other people. So in those situations, you maybe, I think too, how many stories I've heard over the years of someone that's been abusive in some form in a church community, and the leaders of the church allow them to continue to pray for people, or allow them to be deacons. No, there has to be
in the pulpit.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a place where those things have to actually be dealt with. And this is a bit off, but I don't necessarily tell people to go see a lawyer. But now, fortunately, if you've experienced any kind of physical abuse of any kind, you need to report it. And because generally something will be done. It might just be the police giving that person a warning. If you report that and you're still in the house, that might not be good, so get out of the house. Mm-hmm. But in terms of children being abused in an intimate way, you have to report that. If you're a teacher, a nurse, a pastor, whatever, that needs to be reported to the authorities, because the person that did it might say, oh, it's the first time and it wasn't I didn't really do much. And you don't know what their criminal record is. They might have been going around from church to church doing this.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
That's very good. Wow, this went really fast, and it's been very, very good. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I know that this is going to be viewed after the fact. I know people are at work, but this is the time that works best for most people. Well, for me and for you.
Yeah, it's fine.
This is the time. But people will be watching it as well. And as they leave comments, and questions, I'll forward those on to you. And then you can, respond as well. So I just would like to know if you would like to have anything to say in closing comments, and maybe pray for people who might be struggling with forgiveness, forgiving somebody there's a lot of horrific things, and there's minor things as well. Like, forgiveness comes on a scale, but the reality is just that we need to forgive, to release ourselves, to bring healing to ourselves, so the Lord can release us, and as well so that the door opens for them to become a changed individual. So
yeah,
comments.
Okay. Maybe I'll just pray. Is that good? Okay.
Sure. Yep.
Lord, thank you for this time, and the reality that you walk with us through a broken world, a very broken world. And some people that might be watching this are really in a place where things are not good for them. And I pray that you would give them the strength to release that person to you, for you to deal with them. And also that if they are in a place where it is not safe emotionally, physically, in other ways, financially, sometimes even too, that you would help them to forgive, but also have boundaries. That the person that is being hurtful to them will hear your voice and change. And Lord, maybe there's just people that come to mind right now that we need to give to you. We need to put them on your hook. And so, Lord, would you just allow people right now to just name that person? And this is maybe the start of a journey, and put them on your hook so that you can deal with them, and to let go of that bitterness and resentment, Lord. Even if it has to be for that one incident 70 times, 7 times, help them to do that, Lord. Thank you, Lord, that you forgive us. None of us are perfect. And thank you for your forgiveness, Lord.
Amen. Thank you. This has been wonderful. I'll have you on again, because
thanks.
You're my friend, and it was great. It was lots of information, and you're the first guest, and so you'll. Do
I get a prize? Do I get a prize for being the first guest?
My friendship. How's that? You're stuck with me.
Okay. That's all right. That's good. That's good.
Yeah. So we will we'll do it again, but thank you so much, and thank you so much for just bringing your wisdom and your insights and your years of experience in this. And there'll be plenty of other topics to talk about as we go through this, and we'll have you on again. And thank you so much for everything.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.